are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. The war in Yemen has been going on for years. The Secretary General of the United Nations and others have commented on the almost incomprehensible, staggering scale of the humanitarian disaster there. We've covered it on this program. We've also covered political activity in Washington after years of activism and protests. But we haven't done an update on it lately, and there have been some developments. So with that in mind, I've asked my next guest to rejoin us. Always a pleasure to talk to her. Annelle Sheline is a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. She's an expert on religious and political authority in the Middle East and North Africa. She's currently completing a book on the strategic use of religious authority in the Arab monarchies since 9/11, which I definitely want to read. And she has been closely tracking, analyzing, and writing about the situation in Yemen. So first of all, Annelle Sheline, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with the situation on the ground there. For an extended period of time, there were airstrikes being conducted, as I understand it, by Saudi Arabia with the United States assistance. And that was the state of affairs, I believe, the last time you and I talked. What's happened since then?
Yeah, so as your audience may be aware, the good news is that there was a 6-month-long truce in Yemen that went into effect in April, partly in acknowledgement of the holy month of Ramadan. And the truce did expire in early October. The parties were not able to agree to an extension. But what's the good news is this truce has remained essentially continued to remain in effect. The Saudis have not restarted airstrikes. The Houthis have not restarted transborder attacks, although there have been some skirmishes, some fighting inside Yemen itself. That the real big concern having to do with Saudi-led airstrikes, those have not resumed. In addition, certain terms of the truce remain in effect. There have been very limited flights from Sana'a airport, only going to Amman, Jordan. But for years, for the majority of the war, there were no flights from Sana'a International Airport. Meaning that if someone from Sana'a or elsewhere in northern Yemen wanted to leave, they needed to travel overland to Aden in the south, which was a difficult journey that could be very dangerous and very time consuming, and so was very essentially impossible for people like medical evacuees, people in dire need of medical assistance, who would simply be physically incapable of making a journey like that, many of whom did die for want of better medical care. So it's great news that these flights are happening. But what's not so great is the flights remain very limited. There had been an agreement to expand those flights. That hasn't happened. One other piece of good news is that fuel is getting into the port of Hodeidah. This is another aspect of the truce agreement. We are seeing fuel shipments getting through. This is I sigh here because essentially the limitations on imports to Yemen do remain in place. And so while on the one hand, the Biden administration, for example, has pointed to their progress in fostering diplomacy, what UN Special Envoy Tim Lenderking has been able to accomplish. From their perspective, these are all positive developments, and they are. This is truly better than things used to be. But on the other hand, I consider it illegitimate that these limitations remain at all. Why should a sovereign country not be allowed to operate its own airport as it sees fit, to import regular commercial goods that the country needs? One factor that has been getting less attention, in part just because of the dire humanitarian situation and the lack of fuel, which was truly killing the country. Now that those have been somewhat ameliorated, One thing that is now getting a little bit more attention is the absolute lack of container goods. These have been at zero essentially since February of 2018. And so this question of how is Yemen's economy supposed to function if they're not getting just sort of the basic goods and commodities needed to run a functioning economy. Again, I don't think it's legitimate that the Saudi government, with U.S. assistance, is imposing such limitations on Yemen, and specifically the area of Yemen that is controlled by the Houthis.
And let's stop for a second here, Annelle, and just give those listeners who may not have been following the story a sort of broader picture. So Yemen is a country to the south of Saudi Arabia, and of course, correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding, to the south of Saudi Arabia, there has been a rebellion underway, concentrated in the northern part of Yemen. The rebel movement, that's the Houthis. I don't know what the best pronunciation is, and Saudi Arabia, for a long time, with U.S. assistance, was bombing the rebel areas, but there's also been a blockade of the kinds you've described. And I alluded in my introduction to, and you alluded just now, to the humanitarian disaster, but just for those who don't know, the scale of it is devastating, right? I mean, we're talking about the last time I wrote about it was some months ago, but perhaps a year ago, but 1 in 3 children being malnourished or something like that, developmental problems in a large number of children, deaths, food insecurity, massive food insecurity, disease. So anything you can do to fill in the scale of the urgency, just so that people understand this isn't just inconvenience. This is absolutely horrifying for people everywhere in Yemen, as I understand it, right?
Totally. And thanks for having me back up. Yes, Yemen has long been considered one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. I mean, it is unfortunate that there's competition for that title. But at the last count, and this number is now unfortunately somewhat out of date, and I don't know if they've been able to update it, but the last number of civilians who'd been killed as a result of the conflict, so both actual kinetic violence like airstrikes, but also the result of disease and starvation, was 377,000. And a huge portion of those are children, because children are so vulnerable to the effects of malnutrition or lack of clean water. Their systems just can't handle it as well as adults can. And obviously, as many impoverished countries around the world are facing, the war in Ukraine has driven food prices up, made food aid more expensive, more difficult to obtain. We know in the context of the global pandemic that there's less money in going into aid all over the world. So these problems are not limited to Yemen, but Yemen is somewhere that was already dealing with such horrific starvation and levels of violence. And so when I emphasized the small good aspects that the truce has brought about, it's partly in the context of such horrifying devastation and death. And this is part of what's so tragic about Yemen is that it is such a horrifying situation, and yet does not get much attention at all. And so it was exciting when the truce did go into place. It remains promising that we haven't seen a resumption of large-scale kinetic violence, again, from Saudi Arabia bombing Yemen. But I think it's very important to remind those listening that this is indeed a truly horrifying situation for the people of Yemen. And as you said, it's both in areas controlled by the Houthis, as well as in the former South Yemen. One interesting thing I've heard from interlocutors in Yemen is under Houthi control, they control the former North Yemen, including the capital of Sana'a. They are religious fundamentalists. There are grave concerns about their human rights violations, about their treatment of women. But one positive aspect is that they do impose a measure of security, that there is, it's possible to run a business there, for example, although their businesses are subject to heavy taxation from the Houthi authorities, for example. Whereas in contrast, in the former South Yemen, it's more lawless, there's more violence, there is just this sense that you can't sort of have a functioning life anymore. And so there's actually been a fair amount of migration, internal migration to areas controlled by the Houthis, even though, as is frequently pointed out, these are a group that some have compared to the Taliban, that sort of in Afghanistan, where you had a population that was simply so war weary that even rule by a group like the Taliban was preferable because it imposed a measure of security. It allowed people to survive, even if under conditions that they otherwise would not have chosen for themselves.
And I think it's important, and now you're an area expert, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but that I think a lot of people in this country think, well, these are places that have always been at war or have primitive ideas. There are these kind of bigoted or whatever you want to call them ideas, but Yemen, certainly in my, student days, it was thought of as peaceful, as, a lot of beautiful traditional architecture, different, Sufistic and other strains of Islam, tolerated nicely and so on. So that this habit that people have in this country, some people, of sort of, walling off their empathy by saying, well, they've always been like this. It's untrue, isn't it? Or am I wrong?
No, absolutely. I absolutely agree with you. Yemen, I've not been able to go since before the war, and even before the Arab Spring. The last time I was there was in 2010. But at the time, it was, an absolutely wonderful place. It remains a wonderful place for areas that are not, sites of active violence and starvation. But the heritage does remain, to the extent that it hasn't been destroyed. But the people of Yemen are wonderful. The food heritage, Yemen is the cradle of Arab civilization, going back even to sort of before the Arabic language, or sort of the notion of an Arab identity, the sort of the Sabian civilization, many of these South Arabian civilizations that sort of certainly predate Islam and predate some, just even going back into sort of pre-history. Yemen is a remarkable place, and it's truly tragic that this has happened to what was once known as Arabia Felix by the Romans, Happy Arabia, because this was an area that did have more rainfall. Traditionally, they do have agriculture. And as you mentioned, this didn't used to be an area where sectarianism had much salience. Unfortunately, one effect of Houthi rule has been a heightened level of sectarianism. This is typical in conflict scenarios. When they're in the absence of conflict, people are much more able to sort of live in harmony. But then when you're in a position of your security being threatened, it does suddenly start to matter what your identity is in a way that previously it didn't. Unfortunately, we are seeing the Houthis promoting a much more sort of strident Zaydi Shia identity. This is partly they came about in response to efforts by Saudi Arabia to export Salafism, to export their very conservative strain of Sunni Islam.
Right.
In the northern part of Yemen is anathema to the Zaydi beliefs. The vast majority of the population there are Zaydi Shia. In South Yemen, you have more Sunni Arabs, although they're not the same strain of Islam as the sort of very conservative branch of Islam that Saudi Arabia practices. So just in general, it is deeply tragic that this is happening and has been happening in Yemen for almost 8 years now. my hope is that at some point, part of what my work on in trying to make progress in this on the American political side is to try to get the various foreign actors that are involved in the conflict, to get them out, to return control of the conflict to Yemenis. What we know from studying Civil War literature or examples of civil wars throughout history is that when you have the intervention by foreign actors in a civil war, it tends to make the wars last longer. And this is partly due to the fact that if it's just the internal domestic actors on the ground, they're dealing with a finite amount of resources. And so eventually they will run out of the money or the fighters or the will to keep going. But when you have Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the US continuing to funnel in weapons and paying fighters, as well as Iran is sending support to the Houthis, although that is so often brought up in a disingenuous way because the amount of support that Iran is able to smuggle in is really minuscule compared to the hundreds of billions of dollars that the Saudis have spent on fighting this war. So it would be great if Iran got out too, but again, just the scale of what the Saudis and Emiratis are doing really dwarfs what Iran has done. And so the hope would be to return control of this conflict to the Yemenis themselves. And there is a concern there that if that were to occur, you would see the civil war continue and perhaps even get more violent. And this is possible, but I maintain that may be a necessary step in order to finally end the war, because otherwise you run into this situation where, with Saudi involvement, Emirati involvement, the US continuing to sell weapons to these actors, this war could just drag on for decades. And so I do think that it's very important for the US to get out and to signal to the Saudis that the US is not going to support what they're doing anymore, and to return control of the conflict to Yemenis.
And just one last point on that. You're describing a situation, Annelle, where of sanctions and the severe impact these sanctions are having on the ability of Yemenis to travel, to seek medical care, to receive, food and medicines and energy and everything else in their home country. And I just think it's worth emphasizing that state sanctions are a form of violence, right? They're military violence. Because the net effect is injury, death. And so to the extent that we tolerate, enable, support that, we are ourselves either indirectly or directly waging war on the population. It's war. It is not targeted military assault on bases or airfields or anything else. It's waging war on civilians. And it seems to me from what you described that that's a large piece of what's going on with the Yemeni people today.
Absolutely. And I completely agree with you that it's a system of collective punishment. The number, the 377,000 number, which I clarified is due to disease and malnutrition. I mean, that disease and malnutrition would not be at the levels they are if the Yemeni economy were allowed to function, if food and fuel and commodities were able to get into the market. Another crucial aspect of what's going on in Yemen is that public sector salaries have not been paid in years and years. And at present, we have the Houthis saying that the other side, the government that is still considered the internationally recognized government, that they're responsible for paying public sector salaries, and that government, which is kind of a government in name only. I can get into that. It's somewhat complicated. But essentially, the former vice president, who had been the titular president, although he's been in exile since 2015, the Saudis essentially ousted him and replaced him with an 8-member council called the Presidential Leadership Council. But there is a question of what legitimacy do they have to sort of continue to claim this mantle of the legitimate government. But just to get back to your point, this is very much the result of sanctions. And I think a crucial thing to keep in mind here is not only is it sort of a morally repugnant policy to impose collective punishment, it is not effective because populations tend to, they know, that, for example, in Iran, the Iranian population knows that these sanctions are coming from the United States. It furthers anti-American sentiment, and again, in the case of Iran, contributes to greater autonomy and independence of that country's economy in many ways. So although they can be quite devastating, it also eventually tends to be counterproductive. In the case of Yemen, the question is how many people are going to die before we figure out that this is not something that the United States should be involved in.
And how many children are going to grow up developmentally disabled in one way or another? So let's pivot a little bit, if we may, to the United States, since we have had, close involvement in this process while bombing was actively underway by Saudi Arabia with a logistical and intelligence assistance, as I understand it, from the United States. There was some activism around the issue. Senator Bernie Sanders got involved, introduced something in the Senate to restrict or prevent the U.S. from aiding, and again, of course, correct me at any point if I'm wrong, from aiding the Saudis and their air attacks on Yemen. But what's happened since then?
Right. So essentially what had happened previously was under the Trump administration, we'd had a bipartisan effort by both houses of Congress to successfully pass a War Powers Resolution, which was the first time this had passed since the War Powers Act was passed in reaction to the Vietnam War in 1973. Trump vetoed that. And so
what did it say? Just so that people are clear, what did that bipartisan bill say?
Well, just a little context, the Constitution gives Congress war-making authority. And so back in the 70s, Congress tried to reassert this authority, saying the president had fought the Vietnam War, and every war since World War II has been Congress has not authorized these as official wars. They have been executive actions. And Congress essentially has abrogated this responsibility. It is on Congress to reassert this. But essentially what the War Powers Resolution back in 2019 said was to end all US involvement in the Saudi war on Yemen. When President Biden came into power, he said the US was going to end all support for offensive military action, which initially sounded good, but then in practice, we saw airstrikes actually increase, which would mean that the US was not in fact ending support for offensive military action, because 2/3 of the Saudi Air Force cannot function without the assistance of the United States and specifically US military contractors. And so if we saw airstrikes not only continue but increase, that means the Biden administration did not in fact end support for offensive military action. But they used this notion of, well, how do you define offensive versus defensive? From the Saudi perspective, it's all defensive. They're trying to defend themselves from the Houthis. But again, these are airstrikes that the Saudis are doing on Yemeni territory, making them automatically an offensive action.
And is this in response to drone attacks, or is this? Yeah, okay.
Yes, so the Houthis absolutely send drones across the border. People may recall earlier in early 2021, we saw an attack on the UAE for the first time. We've seen attacks on cities in Saudi Arabia, including near the city of Jeddah, for example, as well, which is far into Saudi Arabia, far away from Yemen. And this is part of why we did see the truce go into place and why it has held for so long, is because the Houthis have demonstrated to the Saudis that they can hurt them. And so I think the Saudis are now at a point where they do not want to restart airstrikes, because then the Houthis would restart transporter attacks with these drones and missiles. And so we've reached kind of a detente here. What is concerning is that the Saudis could restart airstrikes at any point, and the U.S. would still be on the hook for helping them because these are weapons and material that we have sold the Saudis, which come with contracts, and so it would require either an executive order from President Biden or an act of Congress to end this support. And what was interesting is we did see in the fall when the Saudis, Biden had gone to Saudi Arabia and sort of kissed the ring of MBS after he said he was going to make them a pariah.
The fist bump, the infamous fist bump, yes.
Bump. And then we saw the Saudis decide to cut oil production just weeks before the midterms, and this was seen as very much intended to hurt the Democrats' chances of keeping control of Congress. And in general, there was a big outcry from Congress of why do we continue to bend over backwards for the Saudis when their interests are clearly no longer aligned with U.S. interests. But instead, this morning I saw reporting from the Wall Street Journal saying, the Saudi-U.S. relationship is on good terms now. They've kind of buried the hatchet, which I think just goes back to this kind of deep dysfunction of U.S. foreign policy, which continues to pursue sort of a status quo arrangement rather than reconsidering why does the U.S. continue to back the Saudi regime.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Annelle, but one could be cynical and say it's only dysfunctional if your definition of its function is something other than to serve an industry and a consensus, an intellectual consensus. Right? If you say that's its purpose rather than U.S. interests in the abstract, it's working pretty well, but not for the people of Yemen or the United States necessarily. I'm sorry to interrupt, but
absolutely. It works quite well for the weapons manufacturers, quite well for the interests that would like to see the U.S. military industrial complex keep chugging along as it does. The Saudis are our biggest customer in terms of purchasing weapons and other military products.
And the customer is always right. Didn't Bernie Sanders, wasn't he trying to get something through again last fall or something? Fill us in on that.
Yes. So kind of right in the final days of the 117th Congress, Bernie stated that he was going to bring the War Powers Resolution to the floor of the Senate. He was going to bring it for a vote. This was at the very last minute. There was not a lot of time to try to make sure that he would necessarily have the votes. And then right as he was coming to the floor of the Senate, we had people like Senator Chris Murphy coming out in support, who had previously supported the War Powers Resolution, but that, there had been some question of, well, under conditions of the truce, is it as necessary now? But Bernie came out and said he was not going to pursue a vote because the Biden administration had reached out and said they were going to work with him to reach a mutually agreeable solution on Yemen. And Bernie has said that he will reintroduce the War Powers Resolution if the administration doesn't make good on that commitment. However, we're now in a situation where the Republicans control the House. And so it is not clear that this would get through.
So although if the first one was passed on a bipartisan basis, I suppose it's not impossible. It could happen, right?
It could happen. I think what's unfortunate is what happened before was there was a big effort among the all Democrats voted for that because it was seen as a move against Trump. Trump was seen as being so buddy-buddy with the Saudis. This was in the wake of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And so this vote was seen as a way to signal their extreme displeasure with Trump's the degree of his closeness to Saudi Arabia, which is there's all kinds of questions about like Jared Kushner's security clearance and like what was going on there.
Right.
And now it's very different because it's Democrats being
Yeah.
asked to vote against a Democratic president who has said that, we have the situation under control in Yemen. I again maintain that the US that the situation is not under control. The US is still supporting this and should no longer be involved. What's especially frustrating is you had many members of Biden's administration before going into the administration supporting this, supporting the WPR, coming out and saying, under Obama, this was a mistake. The US should never have been involved in helping the Saudis wage this war. And now they've shifted.
And it seems to me, and we don't need to go to great detail about this, but given time and all that, but it seems to me that they're using, rather than address the issue itself, they're using what strike me as somewhat disingenuous arguments about the precedent it sets, and that if we limit, well, first of all, Congress says president should declare war anyway, but that somehow if we were to limit the president's ability here, it would limit a future president's ability anywhere, or something like that. It doesn't seem as if they've been arguing against this on the merits of the resolution itself. Is that a fair statement?
Definitely. I absolutely agree that sometimes when you hear some of the criticisms of this, you then have to ask that person, so you want the US to continue to help Saudi Arabia bomb Yemen? Because that's what this means, is you agree with that.
Right.
And
or your interpretation of the Constitution has changed since 2019. Those are the two.
Right. And, there's been some question about what would be the best legislative vehicle. And, there were different proposals. One reason that the War Powers Resolution was put forward is because it has privileged status, just giving sort of congressional rules there, it would be possible to bring it to the floor for a vote. And also it wouldn't require a filibuster-proof majority. It would just require a simple majority. So these are reasons why that was seen as something that could actually limit US support for what Saudi Arabia is doing, whereas these other legislative vehicles would have perhaps in theory would have been even more effective, but they would never have passed. And so why go after don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
One of my least favorite phrases ever, by the way. But so what should people, the Quincy Institute does excellent work. I have great respect for what you guys do. What should people be tracking, following, if they're activists by nature, doing? Maybe nothing, but what should people be keeping an eye on in the months to come?
Well, this is going to come back into Congress. Bernie has committed to reintroducing it, and it's going to need all the support it can get. So your senator, your member of Congress, call them, let them know that you support the Yemen War Powers Resolution, because I and other colleagues working on this are going to be pushing to get this through the House and the Senate. And then the question is, would Biden veto it? That would be particularly egregious given Biden's long, decades of service on the Hill, for him to then thwart the co-equal branch of government that Congress is supposed to be.
Not to mention his own promises when he ran for office.
Exactly. So it's absolute, it's great that Bernie did bring it up, even though it's unfortunate that he decided to pull it at the last moment. But it did require every senator to think about, where they stand on Yemen, to draw attention to this, and just to remind also the rest of the world that this is still happening, and we can't forget about Yemen.
Absolutely. And in terms of not forgetting about Yemen, Annelle, Sheline, I want to thank you again for all your great work in tracking and reporting back to all of us about the situation in Yemen. Again, my guest has been Annelle Sheline, Research Fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. So Annelle, thank you for your good work, and thank you for coming on the program.
Thanks for all your good work.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.